thanks for inviting me here today. I'm just going to get right into talking about the Yogyakarta Principles, and I'll be discussing some of the content. So I know that Anna is going to talk some about how it's being used, despite the fact that it has no legal weight. It is a document created by a group of human rights experts on rights related to sexual orientation and gender identity. The original document was done in 2006, I think maybe made public in 2007. An update in 2017 added gender expression and sex characteristics. So we may think that such a document, we're going to be approaching it with a great deal of suspicion, because we know how gender identity is used in a way that's hostile to women. I think we need to understand that the contents of this document are not entirely hostile to women, that there's some of the content, and there's some of the content that's a guarantee of basic human rights to lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals, and to transgender people that should be guaranteed. And that's separate and apart from the question of the misuse of the concept and advocacy for human rights to replace sex by gender identity, which is what's hostile to women's and girls' rights in transgender advocacy. So we have classic civil and political rights, such as the right to life, security of the person, privacy, freedom from arbitrary deprivation of liberty, fair trial, humane treatment in detention, freedom from torture, etc. I think feminists are going to be looking at even this list of rights and thinking, well, you know, we know what the trans movement is saying about putting people in places of detention based on gender identity rather than sex. And that's true, and that's in here, and we will discuss it. But there is still a right to be treated humanely in detention that is correct as a general principle to guarantee to lesbians, gay men, and bisexuals, and to transgender people. And also economic and social rights, such as the right to work, social protection, health, education, etc. So the same thing, there are going to be aspects of this that explicitly claim to advance a right to identify as a sex that is not materially grounded, but there are also simple basic human rights. And there's mixed messages for the LGB category. I'll discuss that as well. So I wanted to give a few examples of the basic human rights. So on no arbitrary detention, they want to eliminate any provisions that in criminal law that either criminalize sexual orientation or gender identity, or in the words of this particular provision, that invite discriminatory application or otherwise provide scope for arrests based on prejudice. And, you know, we know that there's quite a lot of legislation that makes homosexuality illegal, and in some cases has made it punishable by death, which is also addressed in a principle on the right to life. And we need to be able to recognize that some of the content of what's advanced is correct, even if we don't agree with some of the way it's being done. There's a provision, a principle, protection against sexual exploitation and trafficking, that's based on actual or perceived sexual orientation and gender identity. And to me, the way they talk about it in this principle really looks like the Nordic model. They say that it should not criminalize the behavior or exacerbate the disadvantage of those who are vulnerable, should establish legal, educational, and social measures, services, and programs to address factors that increase vulnerability. And I have to say they did go in the +10 update and say explicitly that sex work should not be criminalized. So with that, they're probably getting into the area of decriminalizing the pimps and the buyers as well, you know, but I think that that particular principle on protection against trafficking, I have no problems with that. I think it's good. Okay. To the extent that that is a problem for some, you know, for some gay men, transgender people, and I don't know, perhaps lesbians as well. Okay, the right to work. Again, these are basic human rights and the right to social protection, and there's nothing in there per se that says that they have to allow people to use a bathroom or changing room that based on their gender identity. Now that we will see in other places, and it's actually qualified. They never say you have an absolute right, as far as I can tell, to that. Right to social protection, it mentions body modification, but again, that even if they have body modification, it doesn't harm women's rights. It might be something many feminists are ideologically opposed to, but that's not directly in conflict with women's human rights. Sexual orientation talks about repealing the criminalization of consensual same-sex sexual activity between partners who are of age. There, and in the principle on same-sex marriage and relationships, they use the term same-sex. However, the definition of sexual orientation refers to attraction, capacity for attraction to and intimate and sexual relations with individuals of a different gender or the same gender or more than one gender. So that's a contradiction. I know Fatina is planning to talk more about that. How does it relate to the sex category? Sex is mentioned in the Yogyakarta preamble, invoking the list of categories of prohibited discrimination that ends in or other status. And their aim there is not about sex, but it's to say that other status in human rights law allows to bring in additional concepts like gender identity and sexual orientation. The preambular paragraph on intersectional discrimination with sexual orientation and gender identity, it uses the word gender in the Yogyakarta Principles, but in the +10, they put sex, where they talk about intersections with race, class, they don't say class, you know, sex, disability, etc. So I don't know what accounts for that. And the Yogyakarta Principles situates sexual orientation and gender identity rights in the context of equality of men and women and elimination of sex stereotyping. So they're really invoking the framework created by CEDAW, the Women's Human Rights Treaty there. And they don't say there exactly how they think it's related. We obviously have our own ideas, and the trans movement has advocated that sex itself be considered a sex stereotype, but that's not exactly said here in what they say about it. So what they say about definitions: gender identity is understood to refer to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including this personal sense of the body, which may involve body modification that you choose, and other expressions of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms. They don't define gender, and they don't define the relationship of gender to sex, except it's linked implicitly by saying it may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth. So you're given to understand there's a link, that it's somehow related, but it may not correspond. Which is, you know, okay, gender expression is defined, is added in +10, and there they talk about presentation of gender through physical appearance, dress, hairstyles, cosmetics, and mannerisms, speech, behavioral patterns, and noting further that it may or may not conform to gender identity. So, I mean, you know, we know, we can call that sex stereotypes, we can call it whatever we want to call it, we can call it just how a person appears that is gender nonconforming, that doesn't conform to what somebody's expectations might be based on their sex or their perceived sex. Sex characteristics is understood as each person's physical features relating to sex, including genitalia and other sexual and reproductive anatomy, chromosomes, hormones, and secondary physical features emerging from puberty. That's defined in the preamble to the +10. So gender expression, sex characteristics are in the +10 update. Now, the impact on women, I think what we're seeing here is we go from gender in the past just being a polite euphemism for sex, or as a reference to the socially constructed differences between men and women, which are the stereotypes essentially, but could also be observed. It could also be, say, in a society where the vast majority of men go to work and the vast majority of women stay home. That's a socially constructed difference between men and women in that society that you could use the term gender to refer to. Now it's being treated as a supposedly innate experience linked to sex, but may be opposed to it. Then sex characteristics is individualized to equalize the potential combinations. So again, like you might have different kind, you know, you might have genitalia that don't correspond to your chromosomes, and that would refer to, that would be accurate for certain people with differences of sexual development or intersex conditions. You might have in your body some secondary physical features. Well, it says emerging from puberty, so I don't know how, if they're intending to include transgender body modification in there or not. Okay, but you could have a person who is male but develops breasts from taking hormones, and they would have the breasts, but it doesn't emerge from their puberty. But what it does is to negate the effect of all of this taken together, is to negate the category of sex as a politicized axis of oppression, and to make it impossible to name women as the female sex. And I do think it's important to not cede the concept of identity to the trans movement. I think women have an identity that's materially based as the female sex. And male will still be the default human being on whom the design of goods, services, laws, and policies will continue to be based, because you're rendering impossible to describe the fact that there are these two classes of human beings based on sex, and one of them has appropriated for itself all of the right to define and create everything based on themselves, and made the other one subordinated. Okay, now I'm having trouble going to my, okay. So some specific provisions that substitute, that deal with this substitution or reclassification by gender identity. So reclassification by self-declared or self-defined gender identity. This is principle 3C. And here they use the term gender/sex, that states shall make sure that you can, that you can take procedures whereby state-issued identity documents that indicate gender/sex reflect the person's profound self-defined gender identity. So among other things, like by assuming, by positing that each person has a gender identity there, then they also take the step to saying, well, it's profound and it's self-defined and you get to decide it for yourself. Whereas many of us would deny that we have a gender identity. We are women by our sex. They also say in that same principle that changes to identity documents are definitive for identification or disaggregation. So that's about statistics, but that also, really actually does say that if you are male-bodied in a female changing room and somebody asks, what is your basis for being there? And they want to see your ID, you have a right to, and you've got your self-defined gender identity saying that you're a woman or that you're female, you would have a right that your identity document should be respected. In the +10 principles, they want states to end sex/gender classification. So they just want to end the classification whatsoever in official gender identity documents. Now, the question I would have is, would it be possible to do that and still maintain some way that you can identify female and male, say in health records? But it does create a problem for women. It's part of the obliteration of the possibility of naming female human beings as a sex. And they say if states are not going to eliminate that classification, here in the +10, they go into more detail to say it really has to be self-ID with no possible gatekeeping whatsoever. Yeah, so let's just go on. Okay, then they go to non-disclosure. This is in the principle on privacy. So here they do have qualifications. It's not an unqualified right to never have somebody disclose, here it's sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, nobody can disclose your personal, profound, innate identity. It's likely that what they really mean is disclosing your sex, which they would consider information pertaining to your gender identity. But it says ordinarily, okay? In the +10, they go into some details that requirements for individuals to provide information on sex or gender have to be reasonable and necessary. Relevant, reasonable, and necessary is required by the law for legitimate purpose, and that they respect the person's right to self-determination of gender. And, whatever that means, is sex or gender the same there? I don't know. Court order is required for disclosure of changes of the name or gender marker. In sports, they want to ensure individuals can participate in line with the gender with which they identify, subject only to reasonable, proportionate, and non-arbitrary requirements. So what does that mean? Does it mean, that the males have to lower their testosterone, or can it actually mean that you can exclude them, that that's reasonable? There's more on place of detention, body searches, sanitation. Maybe we can get to that in the questions. I want to conclude very briefly saying feminist advocacy needs to distinguish itself from positions that reject the basic human rights of lesbians, gay men and bisexuals, and transgender people. The replacement of sex by self-defined gender is a misuse of identity politics. I do not think that identity politics as such is wrong. The women's liberation movement uses it. Class consciousness of workers' movements, Black liberation, disability pride, LGBT pride, We assert identity to find one another, organize, and assert right for liberation. Trans advocacy makes the substitution of the materially based identity of sex for a self-defined gender identity into a goal. You know, it's like they make identity itself the goal of the politics rather than being a means to an end. And I think that's the problem. It's double dipping and faulty logic. We can use CEDAW if we can, but the CEDAW committee has accepted trans women as women without analysis so far. Without analysis, they don't say the basis. So that's potentially an opening. My final point is that I would say the integrity of women's identity as a sex, as female human beings, that female can be the default human being, is linked to female personhood and reproductive sovereignty. And I think we need to address some of these issues together to make sure that we're going in a feminist direction with this. Thank you.